Before modern conveniences like plumbing and aspirin, the poor often sacrificed their bodies and even their minds to get by. Of all the jobs in history, the most disgusting may be that of the Gong Farmer. If you were hoping the job involved either traditional farming or banging a large circular instrument, you're sadly mistaken. Unfortunately, the term Gong Farmer comes from the word gone, which means to go to the restroom. Back in medieval Europe, they obviously didn't have modern plumbing systems. For the most part, they used latrines, giant pits that people stood over to do their business. And most families didn't have their own pits. Often, entire villages would share a set of communal latrines. Enter the Gong Farmer, whose job it was to empty the latrines overnight. And it was just as revolting as you would expect.
Dad?
Yes, son.
I'm not sure this job's for me.
During the night, a team of men would shovel and transport the excrement away. Undoubtedly, the worst job was that of the shoveler, who had to actually remove the waste from the pits. Apparently, they would take anything of value that was accidentally dropped into the latrines, which might be the most medieval form of tipping ever. The history of leather dates back thousands of years to ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia.
This is a reproduction of Egyptian armor. It's a rawhide armor, leather armor.
The first waterproof leathers came into existence 10,000 years ago, and 5,000 years ago, actual leather tanning began. Leather is still one of the most popular textile products in the world, but even today, the job of the leather tanner is incredibly dangerous. The work is done by economically poor individuals who live in impoverished conditions, mostly in Asian countries, including India. According to a study published in the Indian Journal of Occupational and Environmental Medicine, working as a leather tanner exposes you to risks of several different cancers and diseases, including lung cancer, melanoma, and soft tissue sarcoma. This is due to the caustic and hazardous chemicals used in the process, including chromium, arsenic, and formaldehyde. Leather may look nice, but it is produced at great human cost. There was a time when leeches were a cutting-edge treatment used for all sorts of ailments. Leeches are small black worms that feed on blood. They use their razor-sharp teeth and suckers to penetrate and extract a host's blood, and some of them have venom that actually prevents clotting, leading to sustained bleeding if untreated. Leech fever really took off in the 18th and 19th centuries, creating a huge demand for them in Europe and the United States. This resulted in the rise of the Leech Collector, whose job it was to procure the thousands of leeches necessary to satisfy medical demand. While leech bites aren't painful, it's not exactly fun, and removing a leech from a body is much worse. When it came to collecting the little bloodsuckers, some people used horse limbs as bait, while others used their bare legs and feet, which was cheaper but also super creepy. Collectors would often let a leech fill up a little bit, making it easier to take them off. But this gave the leeches the opportunity to pass along diseases, not to mention that collectors had to get the leeches from bogs, swamps, and marshes. The job was usually reserved for the poor, the only ones desperate enough to do it. Wool has long been one of the most popular textiles for clothing and housewares, but wool can't just be taken from a sheep or goat and stitched together. There are a series of processes known as fulling that need to be done to transform the wool fibers into cloth. These were done by workers known as wool fullers. Part of the process of fulling requires treating raw wool with a solution, then beating it to marry the fibers together. While there were mechanized options, many did this by hand, or rather by foot. The fuller would spend his days walking back and forth on damp wool cloth, making it much softer. Considering the enormous demand for wool at the time, a fuller was in high demand. But while walking on wool doesn't sound terrible, the substance it was soaked in was.
Then fulling is pedal labour, because you did it with your feet, and pee is the operative word.
The wool was soaked in stale urine for the ammonia before the fuller would get to it. You can imagine the smell. In addition, fullers didn't wear shoes. They stomped on the urine-soaked wool in bare feet. A truly terrible way to make a living. Fighting in the jungles and rice paddies of Southeast Asia was grueling, disorienting, and potentially deadly. But even among combat positions, that of the tunnel rat stands out as one of the most treacherous and psychologically challenging in history. During the Vietnam War, America's major enemy, the Viet Cong, built and used an elaborate system of underground tunnels to move around the country, which at first allowed them to remain undetected.
The Cu Chi tunnel system stretched for an amazing 75 miles, coming to within 10 miles of Saigon.
However, as soon as the US started sending large amounts of troops over in 1966, they discovered the tunnels, and it quickly became a priority to destroy them and those dwelling inside. The tunnels were built well enough that just bombing over the top of them was not good enough to make them collapse, meaning they had to be eradicated from the inside out. Tunnel rats were assigned to crawl into the underground mazes built by the enemy. Passages were tiny, and once inside, the soldiers faced all sorts of dangers. Enemy soldiers, mines, and booby traps to poisonous snakes and gas attacks. Armed with only a pistol and flashlight, they systematically cleared each tunnel one by one. Needless to say, the job had a high casualty rate and was difficult to endure psychologically, considering the likelihood of not coming out the other side. Since World War II, there has been an enormous shift in how sex work, and consent are viewed in the West. But up until fairly recently, there were actually sex workers attached to fighting army units. In the French army, these mobile field brothels were known as Bordel Militaire de Campagne, or BMC. In contrast to many militaries, the BMC was sponsored by the army itself, with the aim of stopping the spread of disease and allowing men to keep up their spirits so they would fight harder. However, while it may have benefited the male troops, it was quite a different story for the women involved. When French soldiers served in Vietnam in the 1950s, many of the BMC women were taken from the North African Ouled Nail tribe. Once in Vietnam, they were moved by truck to different squads. Then they did double duty as combat nurses, with many dying on the battlefield. At the time, the press and those in power insisted the women enjoyed the job, but they were victims of state-sponsored sex trafficking, seen as sexual tools instead of human beings. It might sound unlikely, but the job of hat making used to be deadly dangerous. Back in the day, hatters would frequently hand-produce hats out of animal fur, a popular textile at the time. In order for them to transform the fur into soft felt, hatters used a mixture of chemicals. Included among them was mercury, which wasn't known to be poisonous at the time. In fact, hatters used large amounts of mercury nitrate during hat making, which often led to mercury poisoning. Mercury poisoning can manifest in a variety of ways, including tremors and hallucinations. The phenomenon gave rise to the phrase "mad as a hatter," which inspired the Mad Hatter character in Lewis Carroll's Alice's Adventures in Wonderland. Though the rampant madness of hat makers was portrayed humorously in the book and subsequent films, it was a serious issue at the time, and absolutely no laughing matter. During the Holocaust, it's estimated that 6 million Jewish people were systematically murdered by the Nazis. Often the populations of Jewish residents in the various European countries that came under Nazi control were herded into crowded and unsanitary ghettos. In order to administer the ghettos, the Nazis created the Judenrat, or Jewish councils. The councils were made up of Jewish ghetto residents who were forced to disseminate and execute Nazi orders and report on their own people. They had to give up friends and families to the concentration camps, and anyone who refused to do so was murdered for their insubordination. The members of the Jewish councils had to walk an impossible tightrope, or they were hated from all sides. This took a grave psychological toll on many of the Judenrat, and several of the members took their own lives out of desperation. While most people probably don't think about it until they need to, the field of pest extermination is ever evolving. Typically, exterminators use chemicals or humane traps to catch unwanted critters, ending infestations as compassionately and professionally as possible. It's a far cry from the old days of rat catchers. As Ike Matthews wrote in his 19th century memoir, Full Revelations of a Professional Rat Catcher After 25 Years' Experience, rat catchers of old used a litany of approaches to get rid of these pests. These included using rat predators like ferrets and mongooses, baiting the rodents with aniseed oil or rhodium oil, and using fake squeals to lure them out of tight spots.
Rat catchers attracted the rats by rubbing a mixture of sweet-smelling oils on their hands. This worked, but rats bite. A lot.
In addition, most of the places where rats lived were dirty and obnoxious, definitely not fun places to set foot in. Catchers usually worked at night, and as a sideline, they were called upon to provide live rats for rat pits at beer houses. They were ostracized when they would carry around their trapped rats. It's no surprise that people were uncomfortable around them. Still, even though they had a disgusting job, rat catchers could take pride in the valuable service they provided to the community. As they say, it's a dirty job, but somebody's got to do it. Modern plumbing provides us with so much convenience and sanitation that they can easily be taken for granted. With the exception of toilets and sinks, most people don't ever have to see the plumbing in their houses or in commercial buildings. It's all neatly tucked away behind walls or underground. But even if we can't see it, our pipes feed into massive sewer systems that transport tons of excrement and waste away. In 18th and 19th century London, as you can probably imagine, the sewers were filled with the most foul-smelling excrement one could possibly experience. It was the job of the Tosher to enter the sewers and look for anything valuable that had been accidentally lost. They'd blindly reach their arms into filthy passageways and cracks in search of a few shillings or other coins. The Toshers would often work in large groups and sometimes had colorful nicknames like Lanky Bill and Short-Armed Jack. The term Tosher comes from the word tosh, which was London slang for things of value taken from drains and sewers. Yes, the job was disgusting, but it was also dangerous to walk the sewers, which were teeming with disease and rats. Eventually, the authorities made it illegal to enter the sewers, but that didn't stop the Toshers. Some of them were quite successful, making enough to be considered upper working class, though at the price of doing a decidedly terrible job. Most people have probably heard the term whipping boy before, usually in the context of being scapegoated or blamed for another's problems.
You're a policeman here in Sparta?
They've got a murder they don't know what to do with. They need a whipping boy.
But would you believe that whipping boy actually used to be a job? The evidence is somewhat circumstantial, but many historians believe that some royal families used to employ whipping boys for their children. These were the days when corporal punishment was common, and it was the job of the whipping boy to take any physical punishment that was meant for a young royal. That's because, compared with a royal, a teacher was low on the social scale, making it inappropriate for them to punish their betters, as it were. Instead, they'd lay into the whipping boy companion, which would somehow, in theory, teach the royal his lesson.
Wrong. Bend over, whipping boy.
The psychology makes no sense. In fact, the practice almost seems like it was more to please a sadistic teacher than help the student. Today, it's impossible to know whether the phenomenon was real, and it hasn't helped that several popular books like Game of Thrones have included whipping boys in their plots. Whether or not it was a real job, everyone can agree that the practice needs to stay a part of history and never return.